Thank you very much for coming, and it's such a pleasure to be here in this beautiful setting. As I told Phoebe, I've only been to UMass in the dark, so I was clearly missing out on such a beautiful setting. So I'm going to start with the opening clip of a film made in 2011 about a project, an internationally funded project funded by a private donor called Famble Talk in Sierra Leone. Famble Talk means family talk. It's internationally funded, but it was the vision of a long-term human rights activist called John Corker, who is Sierra Leonean. So Famble Talk is a project of community reconciliation. And we're going to open with a scene from the Famble Talk bonfires, the context in which the groundwork for the reconciliation takes place.
So this is now a voiceover. Famble Talk, which means family talk in Sierra Leone Creole, is an initiative for community reconciliation after Sierra Leone's 11-year civil war. It was designed as a different kind of post-war justice. When Sierra Leone's National Truth and Reconciliation Commission held hearings of only 5 days each in the country's 14 districts in 2003, Fumble Talk works intensively with individual communities. It emphasises the process of listening, consulting, creating local ownership, building on local practices, and working with communities to find their own solutions. But like Truth Commissions, it adopts a model of reconciliation based on testimony and apology. Fumble Talk's key image, as its name suggests, is that of the family, characterised as an intimate space of resilience, nurture, wisdom, safety, forgiveness, and ultimately rehabilitation. According to the text on the opening pages of the book Fumble Talk, and I quote, "Fumble Talk is built upon Sierra Leone's family talk tradition of discussing and resolving issues within the security of the family circle. The program works at the village level to help communities organise ceremonies that include truth-telling bonfires and traditional cleansing ceremonies, practices that many communities have not employed since before the war. After hosting a ceremony, communities engage in a series of follow-up activities to deepen and build on the reconciliation process and strengthen the community." We don't know the story of Esther. We don't know how the story of Esther and Joseph unfolded after the bonfire. Esther's testimony, Joseph's unhesitating apology, and Esther's immediate, extraordinarily quick act of forgiveness seem to confirm the family talk model of the family both as a site of pre-conflict unity until the war disrupted it, and as a vehicle for the post-conflict repair of the damage the war caused. But this model does not adequately capture the ways in which the war intersected with family relationships. The family, both literally and in the fictive sense of community and nation-state, has long been a site of struggle. Several scholars of Sierra Leone and Liberia have examined the ways in which intergenerational conflict, in combination with gender, wealth and class, as well as with broader political and economic processes, formed one of the roots of the war and shaped some of the forms the war took. Young people's efforts to become adult within gerontocratic family and social structures, their marginalisation in communities dominated by rural elites, their struggle for education and livelihoods in a patrimonial system, their migration to urban spaces and mining areas, and their predicament in a nation-state characterised by institutional failure. All of these shaped young people's actions and experiences during the war and in their post-war lives. The story of the family and the civil war, then, is more than that suggested by the bonfire reconciliation of Esther and Joseph. In Sierra Leone's armed conflict, the generational, gendered spaces of family and community, taken apart and reshaped by the state, by unstable military power, by insecurity, and by new economic realities, has become a terrain upon which authority is recast and hierarchies reconfigured. Armed conflict, as Jiao Biel suggests for mental illness, becomes the ground on which experimentation can occur. Reconciliation practices, I suggest, may also become the ground for experimentation. In much of the literature, and indeed in Fumble Talk, reconciliation is understood in terms of restoring unity, harmony, and group integration. John Bornemann, however, recasts reconciliation in terms of reimagination rather than reintegration, and in terms of difference rather than unity. Writing about reconciliation after ethnic conflict, he argues that, and I quote, "An alternative politics requires reimagining solidarity and sociality, not in terms of integration and consensus in a civil society, but in terms of difference in a dissensual community. Solidarity in a dissensual community cannot be created through the invocation of familiarity, a shared past, or a shared culture," all in quotes. Instead of proposing the people as one, solidarity must begin with an acknowledgement of the heterogeneity of life projects, open toward cultural differences and new experiences of sociality. Bornemann views this reconfiguration of sociality as requiring processes of listening, witnessing and truth-telling. Only these, he argues, will give voice to victims, establish relationships of trust, facilitate redress and rebuild the social world. What I saw in some locations in Sierra Leone however, were processes of reconciliation through practices of truth-telling that led neither to the restoration of a pre-existing family unity envisaged by Fambultalk, nor to the explicit community of descent envisaged by Bornemann. But in a less direct and more tacit way, some of these reconciliation processes did facilitate a reimagining of sociality, a recasting of relationships. In order to explore this, I'm going to place Fambultalk side by side with a reconciliation initiative in the town of Magbonkani in Bombali district, northern Sierra Leone, which toward the end of the war was occupied by combatants, a substantial number of whom were its own young men. First, though, I want to give a brief outline of the generational dimension of Sierra Leone's civil war. Intergenerational struggles over adulthood and succession have a long history in this part of West Africa, where they've been shaped and reshaped by changing trans-regional processes. During the Atlantic slave trade, traders and chiefs targeted young men, especially those from lineages that did not have connections to chiefly power, as potential commodities whose human value could be exchanged for goods and money. Young women formed valuable commodities and were turned into commodities during the internal slave trade, in which women, in which slave wives built polygamous marriages for wealthy men. Young men were again targeted during the trade wars of the 19th century, when chiefs and other big men needed slaves to collect and transport oil palm products, timber, and other forest products for trade with the British colony of Sierra Leone in Freetown. When the British established a protectorate over the Sierra Leone hinterland in 1896, they banned the sale of slaves and abolished slavery 30 years later in 1928. But chiefs and other big men from landowning lineages who had come to depend on slave labour turned to local legal processes, including the gatherings that form the model for Fambultalk. And they used these gatherings to fine young men, often on charges of adultery. So once again you have the politics of marriage intersecting with the politics of male generation, in which a big man will accuse a young man of sleeping with one of his young wives, as a way of kind of binding his labour and giving him fining him transforming the fine into labour, which the young man is really never again able to work off. So it becomes like a form of slavery. At the same time, young men find it extremely difficult under this system to labour for enough resources to marry themselves, and young women, also find themselves in a difficult situation in which their only economic security comes from marriage to a wealthy man who is probably substantially older. So this replacement for slavery was reinforced by senior elite men's control of both land and marriage, creating a rural gerontocratic order that integrated young non-elite men only as indebted dependents. For a time, education and labour migration to the Diamond District in the east or to Freetown in the west provided alternative ways of achieving a livelihood and achieving marriage and thereby adulthood. You become an adult when you're married, both for men and for women. But with the steep decline of Sierra Leone's economy in the decades since independence, these alternatives became less viable. Before, during and after the Civil War, from 1991 to 2002, Sierra Leoneans have regularly expressed their sense of disenfranchisement from the state through a moral idiom of kinship and family, describing the government's failed responsibility to its citizens in terms of a father's failure to care about the hardships of his children. They've also expressed these through stories. Variations on the West African Mande epic Sundiata are told in many parts of Sierra Leone. The son of a king, Sundiata is blocked from succeeding to his father's throne, and is exiled from his kingdom, but he returns triumphantly to overthrow the established order and claim his position. Versions of the story emphasize the agonistic relationship between generations. In the Karanko tale of the crippled hero Yata in Sierra Leone, for instance, the chief dies at the exact moment that his son Yata stands up and walks. In the Mende story of the trickster Musa Wo, the exiled son of a chief, creates chaos and carnage when he returns, exacting revenge on the father who rejected him. Several scholars have pointed out parallels between the patricidal stories of Sundiata and Musa Wo and the violent intergenerational conflict of Sierra Leone's civil war. Significantly, the Revolutionary United Front, RUF rebels, targeted chiefs and other big men for attack. They also replaced the rural gerontocracy with a more meritocratic social order, albeit a very violent and unstable social order, promoting young fighters over older combatants according to their ability rather than their seniority, and thereby inverting the age hierarchy. So these young fighters were desynchronized from lineage time. Instead of having this very long wait for adulthood, the RUF created an alternative form of kind of male time in which young men could achieve adulthood through marriage and accumulate wealth in an alternative manner, a very violent manner. Both these stories of Sundiata and Musa Wo and the RUF's practices of kind of desynchronization from lineage time represent the kinds of processes that Jennifer Cole terms disembedding. Akin to the concept of deterritorialization, disembedding refers to the ways in which young people are drawn out of their previous social world through, for instance, migration, education, religious conversion, and selectively adopt new social forms and cultural practices. Disembedding, Cole suggests, never represents a complete rupture with the past. When young people appropriate new social forms and cultural practices, they do so in ways that draw upon older forms even as they navigate conditions of the present. Different historical periods with different political and economic conditions offer young people different constraints and options, and different forms of disembedding through which to rework their lives. In the years leading up to Sierra Leone's armed conflict, in the 1980s, a new cohort of young people grew up during that country's steep economic decline, when education and employment failed, and when, in 1988, former President Joseph Momo announced education is a privilege, not a right. Some young men from this cohort willingly became combatants after the war broke out in 1991. Others were abducted, both boys and girls, abducted and forcibly conscripted into the combatant groups, initially the RUF and the Sierra Leone Armed Forces, and subsequently the pro-government Civil Defence Forces militia, the CDF, and the Armed Forces Ruling Council junta, the AFRC, who later became allies of the RUF. In these groups, young people became disembedded, often violently, from their former lives and practices. They encountered new practices, some of which offered new paths to male and female adulthood, with new forms of marriage, new social norms concerning age and authority, sexuality and intimacy, and for some, new opportunities for wealth. Yet pre-war social forms shaped these wartime norms and practices, even as they reshaped the young men and women who adopted them in their new environment. Both male and female ex-combatants became different social beings through their wartime experiences and practices. Many young women were feared and stigmatized in their civilian communities to which they returned, as Diane Masurana and Chris Coulter have examined, while many young men, as Mats Utas puts it, experienced reintegration as a form of remarginalization. But at the same time, both young men and young women became more likely to challenge the authority of elders and were less subject to control. Martha Carey even suggests that if anyone can be said to have won the war in Sierra Leone, it was young people, given that they've demonstrated their potential to destroy the social order. In post-war Sierra Leone, formal processes of disarmament, demobilization and reintegration, DDR, excluded large numbers of ex-combatants, particularly girls and women. They also broadly failed to provide most ex-combatants with sustainable livelihoods through vocational training. And like DDR programs in many other places, they were characterized by the missing R, a lack of attention to reintegration. Reconciliation initiatives by NGOs, religious organizations, and Sierra Leone's Truth and Reconciliation Commission, the TRC, did address the relationship between ex-combatants and civilian communities, but typically sought to do so by returning young people to their pre-conflict positions of subordination. At the end of each of the TRC's district hearings, for instance, ex-combatants who testified were expected to take part in a reconciliation ceremony in which they apologized and knelt before senior male authority figures, the paramount chief, the district officer, the imam, who in turn blessed them by touching their heads. The reconciliation in Magbonkani, to which I now turn, was no different in its attempt to reconstitute the age hierarchy. But what happened was more complex. In 1998, the AFRC junta and their RUF rebel allies were driven out of Freetown, where they had ruled for just under a year. Later that year, the RUF made Makeni, the capital of Bombali district, their headquarters, while ex-AFRC troops occupied the town of Binkolo, approximately 4 miles to the northeast. Magbonkani, a small Limba-speaking, predominantly Wesleyan Christian town of 1,000 people nearby, became part of AFRC territory as well. Even before the arrival of the ex-junta, that's the ex-AFRC junta, agents of the state had targeted Magbonkani's youth. In conditions of escalating insecurity, the paramount chief of Safroko kingdom, to which Magbonkani belonged, required each town and village in the chiefdom to provide recruits for the civil defense forces, the pro-government civilian militia. When some villages were reluctant to do so, troops from the Economic Community of West Africa Monitoring Group, ECOMOG, which was fighting on behalf of the government, raided and looted them as punishment. Afraid, parents in Magbonkani asked their sons to volunteer. 23 Magbonkani boys and young men, aged from 12 to their early 20s, turned up for 3 weeks training in Makeni and were then stationed at home, armed with sticks to defend their town against AK-47s. 2 months later, the AFRC came. After attacking the CDF, the Civil Defence Forces headquarters in Makeni, the RUF and AFRC found lists of those trained as CDF and ordered all CDF troops in each chiefdom to come and surrender. The AFRC summoned Magbonkani's 23 CDF members in Binkolo, threatening to burn Magbonkani if they didn't comply. After being conscripted into the AFRC as new juntas, or yonten in Limba, some were deployed to other villages as security guards, others were sent to fight government troops in the CDF, but most of them were stationed in Magbonkani itself. There, under the gaze of more senior AFRC bossmen from other parts of the country, they were given authority over their own parents, senior relatives, and town leaders. The usual image of a young African combatant is of someone removed far from his or her family. But when the AFRC and RUF occupied Makeni and the surrounding area, they conscripted the additional troops they needed from local communities, in or near which they often stationed them. The intimate spaces of community, family, and household intersected in often contradictory ways with this new political configuration. How did the civilians, the combatant groups, and the new local combatants deal with these contradictions? In Magbonkani, the junta bossmen established a series of gradations between themselves and the civilians they sought to control, creating a grey zone of ambiguous categories between combatant and civilian. First, they placed a distinction between themselves and the new Magbonkani conscripts. Although all juntas ate together, the established members wore combat, which is military camouflage, and slept on mattresses inside the house they had requisitioned, while the new conscripts wore civilian clothes, and the house they requisitioned is the one featured in the poster. While the new conscripts wore civilian clothes and slept on mats on the veranda, where they did not sleep. Actually, they were ordered not to sleep, but to remain awake and act as watchmen. Second, the AFRC bossmen reorganized Magbonkani's political hierarchy. They ordered the town to select a figure called the G5. The G5 was a man who would mediate between the civilians and the juntas in order to help enforce the junta's onerous daily quotas of food, palm wine, palm kernel oil, and firewood. And this quota practice was known as jaja. It's the same term used for looting. The juntas consumed most of these products and sold the surplus in an RUF and AFRC market in a nearby town. They also made the civilians select a mammy queen, a woman who would organize and oversee the rotating teams of women required to cook 2 large meals a day for their occupiers. The bossmen made these requisitions through written instructions to the G5 and the mammy queen, headed Letters from the People's Army. So the occupation created a new militarized space that replaced the state with its own form of authority, hierarchy, governance, and economy. The system was enforced in part by the young Magbonkani conscripts, young men and boys who had until then provided most of the labour for their family rice farms, working under their fathers, now found themselves responsible for regulating and requisitioning the products of senior men's labour, including their fathers and their uncles' labour. And they, who had sometimes been vulnerable to being fined, were now empowered to seize items from any houses in the town, to force civilian men to headload looted goods, and to beat anyone who resisted or failed to produce the daily quotas. Many of the civilians lived in the deep bush for safety, hiding and building hidden camps in which they concealed their stores of rice and their belongings, and sleeping in farm huts that provided little shelter from the weather. From these bush camps, the mammy queen and her teams of women would walk to the junta's compound every morning and cook for them. And from these bush camps, the remaining men and women went out each day to farm, fish, and gathered their food requisitions for the juntas. They fed themselves on what was left, which was often bush yams and cassava. "We were hiding in the bush eating cassava," one civilian youth commented. "The juntas were eating rice, palm wine, meat. They were stronger than we were." Junta youth from both Magbonkani and from outside no longer engaged in the forms of actions and speech with civilians through which members of the community had marked and maintained relationships with each other. Instead, they treated civilian elders as if they were their juniors. An elderly man, Pasori, remembered his daily interactions with them. He said, "Each day we would sit and wait for what they would do to us. They would jaja our belongings, asking the little children to carry them away. They would not greet us. They would not talk to us. They would just go into our houses and take what they wanted to take. And with guns in their hands, we were afraid to ask them what they wanted to do." Most civilians remember these inverted relationships in ways that distinguish the behaviour of the new Magbonkani conscripted youth from that of the outside juntas. Pastori, for example, who was beaten so badly when he failed to meet his palm kernel oil quota that his arms were dislocated, told me, "The ones who beat me were the true rebels. It was night, so I didn't see them, but they were from outside." Civilians distinguished between the bad juntas, the true juntas from outside, and the good juntas from Magbonkani, whom they claimed had been forced to act as they did. They didn't do these things with their hearts, I was told again and again. This widespread claim that Magbonkani's junta youth were not acting for themselves, but were vehicles for the agency of their external junta bossmen, as we will see, the dominant narrative that both ex-juntas and the civilians adopted during the post-war reconciliation initiative. It was also very similar to the dominant narrative of NGOs responsible for the reintegration of child ex-combatants in Sierra Leone. But whether civilians also made this claim during the occupation in order to live more easily with its disordered intimacies is difficult to determine. For the young conscripts themselves, the occupation disembedded them from the underlying realities of generational asymmetry to which they'd been subject. New ways of thinking about primary relationships became possible, juxtaposing and contradicting those of parent, child, and elder youth with those of junta civilian, of occupier to occupied subject. New constellations of power helped to create new forms of social personhood. But ironically, just as junta youth were disassembling the age hierarchy, the weight of this hierarchy fell even more heavily upon two groups. First, the women who had to come in and cook for the juntas, and the civilian male youth in Magbonkani who had not been conscripted because their families gave them primary responsibility for producing the daily quotas for the juntas. Some conscripts located themselves firmly as juntas, eagerly adopting bush names that marked a reordering of previous relationships. These conscripts often engaged in abuses that subverted the family and community relationships in which they had previously been embedded. Corporal Molest, that's Corporal Molest, who was 12 years old at the time, terrorized Magbonkani by his looting, cursing and threatening behavior. Opuku, based in Binkolo, the AFRC headquarters a couple of miles away, attempted to steal on behalf of the Binkolo juntas who he was with, fish that Magbonkani's headman had caught as part of his Jaja quota for the Magbonkani junta. When the headman resisted, Opuku cursed him and nearly shot him. Another youth led juntas from a different area to the place where his father had hidden his family's store of rice, which the juntas promptly seized. This was an extremely serious betrayal of his relationship with his family. At the other extreme, 3 young Magbonkani conscripts rejected these new reordered relationships. They sought to re-embed themselves with their civilian families by repeatedly escaping, with varying degrees of success. Marcus, for example, found his parents' hiding place in the bush and managed to hide there for most of the occupation. He told me, early morning I went to the farm, I was in the farm all day, I slept in the town at night. Many of the civilians and the other conscripts knew where Marcus was hiding, but kept his secret and protected him by warning him of impending raids. Most of the young conscripts, though, were suspended uneasily between the conflicting identities and imperatives that the occupation opened up. Although some of them had committed no abuses in Magbonkani, many of them engaged in looting, again, Jaja, looting villages in the next chiefdom to whose residents they were not related. And Adam, who manned the checkpoint at the boundary of Magbonkani, with 2 other but more established juntas, told me when I asked him about his life during the occupation. He said, I didn't feel fine, they treated my people badly, but there was no way to talk. But he also became friends with the 2 juntas with whom he lived and worked, internalizing their views of the civilians to whom he had just referred as his people. His junta friends, he told me, sometimes disciplined the ones who did bad, that is, the civilians who did bad and who did not take orders. Adam thereby expressed an oscillating, contextually based insider-outsider subjectivity. In early 2000, following the 1999 Lome Peace Accord, the outside juntas left Magbonkani. 3 of the original 23 Magbonkani conscripts had died by this time. 2 had been killed in combat, and one had died of illness. 4 youth who had been in combat outside the village went through the national disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration process. 14 ex-combatant youth left Magbonkani. 5, including Corporal Molest and Opoku, fled because of the abuses they'd committed during the occupation. And 9, who were able to maintain their relationship with their family in town, left to find work in cities. 6 ex-junta youth remained in Magbonkani, attending secondary school in Binkolo, helping on their family farms and cultivating their own groundnut plots. Some fathers rejected these ex-junta sons. The father of the youth who'd revealed where the family rice store was hidden said, "He wasn't born to me, I don't want him anymore." A year later, in 2001, the headmaster of Magbonkani's primary school, Edward Cisse, was selected to attend a workshop on the culture of peace building organised by the Council of Churches for Sierra Leone and funded by Peace Fund Canada. This workshop had the goal of fostering local-level reconciliation by involving community leaders. During the workshop, he developed the idea of a reconciliation service in Magbonkani's Wesleyan church. Afterwards, Mr. Cisse worked with leaders in Magbonkani, the headman, the Wesleyan church pastor, the school teacher, the Women's Cult Association leader, the herbalist, and the blacksmith to design and implement this reconciliation initiative. These were considered Magbonkani's community leaders, among whom none of the town's young people, ex-juntas or not, male or female, were counted. In the reconciliation service, the former juntas who remained in Magbonkani made confessions and were prayed over by the congregation, who asked God to give both the ex-juntas and themselves cool hearts, which is a term for reconciliation. It means it's the opposite of having a warm heart in which you're angry, you're aggressive, you're fierce. If you have a cool heart forms the basis for relationships within the community. According to one civilian, they, meaning the ex-juntas, confessed and asked us for forgiveness. We prayed for them. They were forced to join the rebels. So note how similar that was to Joseph's confession at the beginning of the Fable Talk video. Edward Cisse described the service and the subsequent relationship with the former juntas. He said, they confessed, they said it was not their fault. The rebels held them. If they didn't go with them, they would burn the village, kill their parents. Then we prayed. We said everyone should forget and forgive. They asked for protection and said they would never do that again. Now they're very friendly. Even when their companions provoke them, call them by their names from the bush, they say, stop, I don't want that name. I'm a changed man. One of the young ex-juntas, John, described the service for me. The message was, he said, to end the war, how to behave, how to take care of the home, to respect the elders, to be careful how we acted. Some former juntas experienced internal changes during the service, interpreting these as akin to a religious conversion. According to another, Patrick, he said that they prayed for us because Satan had come inside us. I saw things that I was not used to seeing. They prayed for anybody who had done bad and forgave them. They prayed for me. I felt the Spirit come inside me. I felt fine. I said, thank you, Master Jesus. He said, for the way they had made me go and steal, let Papa God forgive me. This service thereby pulled together 1. Christian ideas of sin, Satan, repentance, forgiveness and redemption. 2. Rites of passage as a vehicle for social transformation. 3. Local practices of social forgetting as a response to violence. And 4. What the scholar Susan Shepler describes as arguments of abdicated responsibility, which is the dominant discourse of NGOs in relation to child combatants. In other words, I didn't do it for myself, I was forced. And 5, local understandings of reconciliation in terms of a cool heart, in which the heart is purged of anger and fear, giving it the capacity for proper social relationships, especially and quintessentially respectful relationships with the elders. So having a cool heart has this very gerontocratic sense. As a cultural product of community leaders, all but one of whom were senior men, the Reconciliation Service reconfigured the contradictory and ambiguous relationships of the occupation by reconstituting the age hierarchy. By crafting a shared narrative of compulsion by outside juntas, followed by a moral transformation, it cast the young ex-juntas both as childlike, incomplete agents and as subject to the forgiveness of their seniors. Then in 2003, just over a year after the Church Reconciliation Service, statement takers from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission came to Magbonkani. Only 3 people out of 1,000 gave statements about the abuses they suffered. The town headman and other leaders sent a message around the village warning people of the potential dangers of talking to the TRC. According to one young male victim of severe beatings by the junta, what happened was, when the statement takers came, the big people in the town went around and warned us younger ones, saying, you should be careful what you say. Let us not get another problem tomorrow. The war is finished, we suffered it and we bore it. Although the war was over, Magbonkani's residents, like many others I spoke to during the time of the TRC hearings, feared future retaliation, both from ex-AFRC combatants from outside their town and from the former government of President Tijan Kaba, who had explicitly blamed Northerners for the war. It's better to suffer once than to suffer twice, I was often told. Survivors especially feared being summoned as witnesses before the Special Court for Sierra Leone, where they believed their testimony might generate serious retaliation. Security was not the only consideration, however. The Wesleyan Reconciliation Service had stabilized not only the civilians' relationship with the young ex-juntas, but also their relationships with the young ex-juntas' families.
The arrival of the TRC, with its encouragement to give statements about the war and to talk about the past, threatened to disrupt both sets of relationships. The headman, who was a close friend of Opoku's father, refused to make a statement about Opoku's abuses. He said, "I didn't want to talk about my friend's child." But a view of the Wesleyan Reconciliation Service as producing a return to pre-war status quo would be misleading. If the disenfranchisement of male youth was rooted in part in a rural economy in which senior and elite men extracted their labour and its product, this economy had been undermined. Most of the town's youth, ex-juntas and civilians alike, had left for Freetown or for the Diamond District in the east. Not everyone had gone, but senior men complained about the lack of cooperation of the youth and even of the younger children who remained, whether they were ex-juntas or not. A few miles from Magbonkani, on a visit to the village of Kayasi, the headmaster, my research assistant Moses and I walked through farms of vibrant green rice in July 2004. Edward and Moses were amazed at the size of these farms. Edward exclaimed, "I will report back that we are only playing in Magbonkani. All of the farms in Magbonkani together are the size of this one farm." "Why?" I asked. "Lack of cooperation," he responded. "Families are eating imported rice." By lack of cooperation, Edward meant young men's unwillingness to work on their family farms as compared to their own groundnut plots. Later, Moses told me of a conversation he'd had with his father, Pasara, who was the headman of Magbonkani. Moses, who was at that time a university student, remembered rushing home from school to help on his father's farm when he was younger, motivated primarily by the meal that they would share together from a single dish when they finished working. But now, faced with Moses' uncooperative younger siblings following the war, Pasara had resorted to paying his remaining children to work on the family farm. Nor was he the only senior man in Magbonkani who did this. He attributed the difficulties of controlling his foot-dragging children to the new prominence of children's rights, which young people heard about on the radio and in school. No, Moses had told him, the rights of the child doesn't mean paying your children to work. It means encouraging them to work instead of forcing them. But I'm old and tired, Pasara said. It's too difficult. And now, Moses told me, instead of eating together from one dish, each child gets a separate plate. Senior men in Magbonkani no longer exert the same control over young people, whether ex-combatant or not. If, during the occupation, the age hierarchy was reordered for the young juntas but not for other youth, the period of post-conflict reconstruction in some ways facilitated a broader process of generational change. In the town's reconciliation service, the process of truth-telling did not produce the dissensual solidarity envisaged by Bornemann. It asserted a surface reality of the reassertion of family and community unity, with the formal subordination of youth to elders. But as Marianne Ferme has established, surface realities in Sierra Leone exist in counterpoint with the underneath of things, the reality beneath the surface. The reconciliation initiatives promoted by NGOs, including the Wesleyan Reconciliation Service, don't exist sui generis. They converge and collide with discourses of human rights and children's rights in often unpredictable ways. In Magbonkani, the surface of affirmations of family and respect for elders in the Reconciliation Service masked and, I believe, thereby facilitated the generational reordering underneath. There was a different kind of dissensual solidarity from that which Bornemann envisaged, built upon a doubled reality of difference. But because of the loss of young people and the decreased cooperation of these youth who remain, rice yields are decreasing in Magbonkani, and families struggle to buy increasing quantities of imported rice. Writing about the same phenomenon in the Makeni area more broadly, Catherine Bolton notes that, and I quote, "Young people have extricated themselves from the control of elders but with disastrous consequences for food security." While both the occupation and the reconciliation service that followed it produced a new social reality, this reality cannot be viewed as a resolution, a stable endpoint. If the story of the town where youth ruled their fathers is the story of an experiment, it's an experiment that is apparently not over. Toward the end of the Famble Talk film, another woman stands before another bonfire. This is Dabu in Kalahun district, which was under a lengthy occupation by the RUF during the war. Half the town fled. A substantial number of those who remained joined the RUF. And those who didn't join had to work for them. Excuse me. The woman who speaks by the bonfire, who is not named, accuses Chief Mada Ndole, who is also the district chairman of Famble Talk. When I see him, she says, some even speak to him. He took my meat from me and ordered people to beat my husband. Chief Ndole, evidently surprised and startled, gives a rather equivocal apology. I have some cough sweets in here. Chief Ndole, it was very difficult to live. We were in very hard times. We were all very hungry. So I gave the order to take meat from you. If what I did not go down well with you, I am asking you to forgive me. The camera turns to John Corker, Famble Talk's founder, who comments on this interaction today. That woman would have had problems now because she accused the chief. And that's why we say we create a sacred space. It was done out of that space. If it was done out of that space, it would have been a crime. But as a chief and also a district chairman of Famble Talk, it's very unusual for people of such high status in society, in the middle of such a huge gathering, to own up to something they know they did. I've got one more paragraph to get through. In Famble Talk, the rhetoric of the restoration of the tradition of a purportedly unified but implicitly gerontocratic patriarchal is juxtaposed with a contrasting liberal discourse of egalitarianism and rights. This egalitarian discourse is located in a particular time and place with special rules, the bonfire. I would call the Famble Talk bonfire the sacred space, writes John Corker in the family book, in the sense that it's only within that circle, within that bonfire, that you can say anything you want related to the war. You can call on anyone who did something bad to you, regardless of his or her status, even a chief or minister. The bonfire is embedding space, if only temporarily. As with the post-bonfire relationship between Esther and Joseph, with which I began, we don't know whether the reconfiguration of relationships established during the bonfire had enduring consequences, and if so, what those consequences were. But I think that both Famble Talk's bonfires and Magbonkani's reconciliation service suggests a reframing of conventional understandings of reconciliation. In convergence with other discourses of post-conflict reconstruction, such as the discourse of rights, reconciliation in practice involved the renegotiation of young people's choices in relation to others, the intersection of new norms and practices with older ones, the local engagement of globalized ideas and processes, and the opening up and closing of different opportunities. Reconciliation in practice may have just as much potential for a process of disembedding as it does for the reassertion of prior forms of sociality, despite, or sometimes because of, its rhetoric of restoration. Thank you.
I'm Carolyn Bogle. I'm a faculty in the College of Nursing, and I thought it was very interesting. I was very interested in the topic because of all the civil wars and unrest that go on in some of the countries, and particularly right now, the situation in Somalia. And I guess I was, and it horrifies me to see the child soldier. And I was just wondering if this is at all applicable to that country, because, you know, their civil war continues, I believe, and hopefully, and there'll be this reconciliation. And so I was just wondering, in terms of your work and your research, is it applicable to some of the other nations where this kind of thing goes on?
I think that the message to derive from this is that process is that, you know, first of all, to kind of reiterate the message that many people have brought, which is that you know, children are political actors, and you have and yes, you know, children are forced in very many situations to become combatants, but not always. And for those who are forced, it's a gross oversimplification of their experience and their agency to describe them as only, you know, subsumed by the will of others, that tends to be a means by which we depoliticize them, to describe them only in terms of, you know, children who are victims. But this is something that many other people have said. I think what I want to emphasize here is, you know, here's a situation in which people are, you know, under the umbrella of reconciliation, we're actually trying to recast the hierarchy that had kind of kept them in a trap. And they had this had also been the objective of the RUF combatants. But what actually happened when they had abducted young people was that the young people in fact find themselves in a different kind of hierarchy. So they were disembedded from lineage time and re-embedded in another kind of, you know, generational hierarchy, even if it's one in which, you know, younger people were able to go further in this armed group than they would have been at home. So while the RUF itself, which was kind of inverting relationships, while this kind of disembedding was really a kind of re-embedding in another kind of hierarchy, I think that it was in the reconciliation relationship that that actually had the most potential, not just to return to the status quo, but to kind of remake new political relationships, new hierarchical relationships, not necessarily, you know, very successful ones, given that this process was kind of undermining the economic sustainability of the village. But nevertheless, you know, this was the experiment, and I think this is something that is generalizable. Let's look at reintegration and reconciliation in ways that go beyond restoring the status quo, especially in relation to generation and, of course, gender. So I can't speak to Somalia particularly, but I think that would be the kind of broader theme. Carol.
Thank you. I'm struck by many different things in your talk, but one of them is it's not your job as an anthropologist, but I keep sitting here thinking about policy. And part of what you're describing is a set of international interventions that, first of all, with DDR, for example, often don't even meet their own requirements as they have conceived them, never mind what it might actually be needed on the ground. And second of all, around reconciliation, interventions that come with a particular set of ideas about what reconciliation can and should be, which are often in many ways utterly ignorant, really, of what those processes, what effects they will have and what they will be used for in a local context. So it's a very jarring, in a certain way, a very jarring reminder of the difference between well-intentioned policies and what happens when they arrive in places that people don't have very complex understandings of, and so on. So it's not your job to think about policy, but I'm wondering where this leaves you. What does it leave you thinking about these, very disrupted social spaces around generational issues, around gender issues that are the product of war, and then even if whoever was acting understood enough what was going on before, how was it transformed by war, the question of whether you're re-embedding old hierarchies or trying to create more open social spaces that also are economically viable for communities and so on, it's like, even if the interveners had that kind of knowledge, which they don't, as a rule, what does that leave you thinking about how anyone should be acting in this kind of context?
Well, Fumble Talk seemed to me to be such an exciting project. It was a local initiative, privately funded by a small peace foundation in this country, and they functioned by going from community to community, basically asking people what they wanted, talking to people about what had happened to them individually and to the community during the war, and what kinds of what were some of the consequences of the war for them, and what they wanted, and was there anything that they wanted to do about it. One of their projects was creating a community farm, for instance, and so that actually would be a wonderful field project for somebody to study what happened to those farms, and who worked, and who, how they were organised, and what happened to the produce. But it seems so wonderfully bottom up, except where it kind of met gender and generation. And then I have not done field work with Fumble Talk, but that opening scene raised for me, and I'm sure it raised for a lot of you, the thought, what is going on behind that? So the woman who was raped by her, by her uncle figure, we don't know whether he was her biological uncle or not, forgave him so very quickly that what's going on there? What kind of pressure was she under to give such quick forgiveness? As compared to, so I think we need to look at what happened there as a performance, and to compare that to the father who refused to forgive the son in Magbonkani for revealing his the location of his rice store, and you're no longer my son, that you're no longer a son to me. And so I think generation is something. I think that in Fumble Talk, the idealization of the community and the idealization of the family as a space of harmony, as opposed to a space of struggle, was part of the problem, and the techniques they used actually seem very flexible. They seem to represent in a remarkable form, John Borneman's recommendation about listening and witnessing, and being led by what survivors themselves prioritize. But then, how do we need to find ways of melding that to a less romanticized notion of community, to a less romanticized notion of family, and to an understanding of how communities are divided and how families are divided and what kinds of struggles young people face, what kinds of struggles women face. So I guess that's fairly simple.
Nobody else has a question. I do have one. You go ahead, please.
Thank you very much. My name is Rajni Srikanth. I'm a faculty member in the English department. My question is actually, it might sound a little long-winded, so I apologize. I'm struck always by efforts in places of conflict to come up with forms that seem somehow embedded in local traditions. Right? So I'm thinking about the Gacaca courts in Rwanda, and also the ways in which the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was sort of framed in South Africa as deriving from Ubuntu, the sense of, you are because I am because you are, that kind of thing. And so I think I'm curious about, to what extent these efforts of reconciliation are very self-consciously modeling themselves on available traditions. And I was also struck by what you said, that on the one hand there is this notion that going back to the framework of the family suggests harmony, whereas in fact reconciliation is a matter of dissent, which I think that's a very powerful way of thinking about it. And I guess I'd really like you to talk to that. Also, whether you know of any, whether there's any kind of link between what's taking place in Sierra Leone and what's happening in other parts of Africa with conflict and societies.
That's a great question. Reconciliation as a matter of dissent, I think. It's interesting that Michael Ignatieff was always very, when he wrote about TRCs and wrote about the role of truth commissions was to narrow the range of permissible lies. He wasn't very optimistic about the value of achieving some kind of commonly understood story of a common national story. That's not going to happen, and nor should it happen. And the most use that we can do here is narrowing the range of permissible lies, such as lies about black South African activists were never murdered, or it was all for law and order, and this kind of thing. But I think that Michael Ignatieff aside, there is an overwhelming focus in truth commissions on kind of a shared national narrative. That was certainly the rhetoric in Sierra Leone, and it seems to be the rhetoric in many places. And obviously, you can see how in a context of ethnic conflict, the idea of having one single agreed upon version is might be attractive, but it doesn't seem to be. But I think such a single narrative would just become another form of kind of forced agreement, and so I find the idea of reconciliation as a matter of dissent very attractive, and what I think, but dissent that may not take the form of open argument. And I think that's what's interesting about the reconciliation ceremony in Magbonkani, in this Wesleyan ceremony, and probably and I think other places in Sierra Leone, other kind of local practices in Sierra Leone too, in which there's a kind of surface consent to hierarchy, while there's an unspoken refusal to be to be bound by those hierarchical relationships anymore. But it saves the face of those who are in the, you know, in positions of authority within the hierarchy, not to have this kind of open rebellion. It saves the face to have, it saves their face to have kind of polite relationships. And so I think this, and so I think that kind of looking how to achieve a kind of diplomatic dissent, how to make it possible for people to appear to agree but really not to, but to have some kind of event, some kind of focus that stands for their for their agreement, although that agreement is not a consensus. I was very struck by a film about gacaca, which, of course, you know, gacaca is not at all a local tradition. There is a local tradition called gacaca, but it's not. It's not that this kind of government created local legal mechanism. But in the film, in one of the 3 films on gacaca, I think one of the 4 films made on gacaca by blanking on the filmmaker's name. Yes, gacaca living together again in Rwanda. It's the middle film called, in Rwanda we say the family that does not speak dies. Here's this kind of reconciliation ceremony between the community and a returning génocidaire who has just been released from jail, the overcrowded jails, on condition that because he confessed. And he is shunned, basically, in the village. And he comes in kind of whistling and reminiscing nostalgically about the times when the patrols were chasing people. And the film is following him through his relationships with people, following other people in their kind of dread of this man coming back among them, and how they deal with their own memories. And one of the women says to the film crew, "You're seeing Ramfrizi, aren't you? If he were in front of me, I would tell him this." And this kept being repeated, so they realised that what was really happening. They realised it once they translated the footage, that what they were really asking for was for the camera crew to arrange a meeting, which they did. And what was fascinating was that at this meeting, Ramfizi and the woman who kept saying, "If he were in front of me, I would say this to him," she refused to look at him or acknowledge him at all, but just kept repeating, "If he were in front of me, I would tell him this." And then he kind of uttered the usual, "I was forced, it wasn't my fault." So what happened? But out of that came a situation in which people, knowing surely that it was a pretense, knowing that it was a surface reality, found a way of allowing him to live there and saying, "Okay, we didn't realise that you were forced. But is this really, truth, catharsis, and forgiveness? No, this is not. But I think it's what kinds of injustices are people living with in order for this to take place? But it is. So I'm not sure. So I wouldn't hold this particular form of dissent as a model. I'm just saying that's another form of dissent, and I think that there should. But I think we should start with those forms of dissent and recognise them for those forms of kind of underneath realities, and rather than just accepting at face value people's words about reconciliation, to find out what does the performance of reconciliation actually mean here, what is happening here. Yes, Phoebe.
Thank you. I was really interested in your discussion about the reimagining of power hierarchies, and I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about when these youth, in this more post-conflict phase, were disempowered, if there are times when this becomes, they use violence to reassert the power. During the conflict, they were obviously expressing themselves through forms of violence, and it was seen as a way to assert power. So what happens when this power is taken away? Do they try to reassert themselves through more different forms of violence now that the conflict has ended?
They didn't, but remember, a lot of them fled.
Right.
A lot of them fled, because they were aware, those the upuku who verbally abused and nearly shot the headman and seized the fish he was catching, and several others. They knew that they couldn't stay because. But what I thought was interesting was that there was a range of what these young men chose to do when they were presented with this alternative system that allowed them to that disembedded them from this age hierarchy and empowered them, kind of, because they were always under the thumb of the true juntas, the outside juntas. And so, no, they didn't. Many fled, and their relationship with the village. I mean, it might have changed now, but as far as people were concerned now, this relationship is broken. And the headmaster who organised the Wesleyan ceremony was, looking forward to a situation in which that might not always be the case. And many other young people who were in the junta but had good relationships with the village, they too fled. They not because they were afraid of the relationships within the village, but because damn it, I can move now and I can go to a city and I can work and I can start earning money and I can start getting somewhere with my life. So trying to kind of break out of the trap of endlessly waiting for adults and endlessly waiting to have the capacity to marry, preferably before their fathers die. So no, they did not seize power back. They weren't attached to anything that would enable them. They were no longer attached to a combatant group that would be able to back them up if they did that, and many of them had never severed their ties. Many of them tried to preserve tenuous ties to either they were kind of in the armed group, either in the AFRC with tenuous ties to the community, or they were with the community and they were trying to evade the armed group. So reimposing their power wasn't possible, but they showed. People talked a lot about the war might break out again. That was so that they may not have had an armed group there and then to back them up, but there was always the possibility that it might break out again. And if it did, there was a nervousness. There was a nervousness about what young men would do, young men in particular.
College of Nursing. I do have one more question if nobody else does. I want to I couldn't help but think I was very struck by the process of the storytelling and the forgiveness as being a very Christian ideology, and that I immediately thought of confession and absolution. And the community, I think you mentioned this was the Christian community.
Yes, it was.
And, you forgive my ignorance about the Civil War in Sierra Leone. I get the impression it was more of a militaristic conflict over resources and not necessarily one of a tribal ethnicity.
It was not an ethnic conflict,
right.
although it developed ethnic characteristics. It did develop ethnic tensions.
And that's what my question is at, you know, I look at Al-Qaeda influence, Al-Shabaab right now. You know, these factions, they recruit young men. And I couldn't help but thinking in the last commentary about where did these young men go, I couldn't help but think maybe recruited into terroristic groups, perhaps. And thinking that this type of reconciliation process may not be applicable in an area that is highly Islamic, perhaps, given, I don't know, I'm not sure how it came about with the confession and the absolution, but it did strike me so much as that, you know.
Oh, within Sierra Leone, these processes, well, you know, Sierra Leone is an interesting country, and there's not, people are Christian. I call it personal pluralism. They're kind of Christian and you know, quote, traditional, although there isn't really that category. Or they're Muslim, especially Muslim and traditional at the same time. And actually most of the reconciliation rituals that I saw were to do with making offerings to God, and the word Allah was often used to refer to God. So most of these reconciliation ceremonies were offerings to God and the ancestors. It's just that this one happened to be in a Christian village, and so it was a Christian service. But yes, but certainly, you know, Muslim communities were just as involved as Christian communities in this process, and so I don't think that Muslim identity is necessarily an obstacle to processes of reconciliation. Certainly in situations in which in which young people have few alternatives. Certainly, if religious groups, whether they are Islamic groups or whether they are kind of Christian fundamentalist, more kind of radical Christian groups, or Hindu nationalist groups, all offer these kind of forms of experimentation. They all offer these alternatives to the status quo, or maybe a different, which again often turns out to be a different kind of status quo.
My name is Ryan Victor, independent researcher, and I was just wondering if you could speak to this, that it seems that the reconciliation process, it ends up being sort of submission by the aggressors back to the system and the hierarchy. And in places like Rwanda, we see a great uneasiness even decades after the genocide. And I was wondering if you could speak to what the next step is after this, because obviously the reconciliation allows for saving face and creating a system where people can come back into the fold. But is there a next step?
I guess it's what kind of fold they're coming into. And that's the problem with Rwanda, because the fold in this case is an autocratic, repressive government. So people are terrified by the process of gacaca, and in many researchers who've conducted fieldwork on the gacaca find that actually ethnic identity is more become kind of more firmly entrenched in the gacaca process. Yes, so in reconciliation processes, what it tends often to be framed by victor's justice. And I thought what was interesting about Magbonkani is that victor's justice. I mean, victors would be the people who were never combatants in the first place, the civilians. But what was so interesting was that it wasn't totally, it was, the performance was that of fixes justice, but the reality underneath was more of a negotiation, more of a reorganization, of a renegotiation of power.
One more. So you were talking about you mentioned in passing the exclusion of most women and girls from the DDR process in Sierra Leone. I was wondering whether in either of the two locations that you talked about, whether there were women and girls who had participated in armed groups, whether there was acknowledgement of them. The only way they have figured in the pictures here are as the victim of rape in this one.
Yes.
Right. Do you know anything about?
In Magbonkani, the combatants were all male, and I was asking, now, did any of these guys have any girlfriends? Did the outside juntas have any girlfriends in the town? No, they brought their own. What about the inside juntas? No. There's a reality there, I think, that I wasn't able to get at. There was a rape in Magbonkani. There was a rape of a young mother by a junta. And what was interesting there is that raping a young mother is particularly heinous because it's understood as drying up, as turning her milk against her baby. So kind of making the baby sick, almost poisoning the baby. So even the outside juntas were, and he was traced because he'd left it. He ran off, he was startled, he ran off and he left his shoes behind, so he was able to be traced very easily. And the response was, wow, you really are, you really are quite dreadful. We are juntas and we do this and we just come in and jar the village, but you come in and you rape a young mother. So what was interesting, I thought, was the way that everybody condemned this man, and he was very severely beaten, and the mother was not blamed. The woman was not blamed for being raped. At least, I wasn't there at the time, but by the time I came in 2003, 2004, that seemed to be the reality. But normally, rape is extremely secret and private, and is not a topic to be brought into the open through talk.
Well, I'm sure that all of you, like me, have been left with many things to be thinking about. So I want to ask you to join me in thanking Dr. Shaw for this